He stood alone at the main gate. The iron bars were cold against his back. In his right hand he held a Luger pistol, but the barrel was pointed at the dirt. Behind him, inside the barbed wire, were 9,000 angry men. They were starving. They were desperate. They were trained killers, pilots and air crews who had dropped bombs on his homeland for years. In front of him, on the horizon, the sky was burning. The Soviet Red Army was less than 10 miles away. Their artillery shook the ground like a heartbeat. He was a German colonel, the commandant of the camp. By all laws of war, he was a dead man walking. The Russians would execute him on sight. The prisoners behind him might tear him apart with their bare hands before the Russians even arrived. But that morning, he did not run. He did not call for reinforcements. He unlocked the gate. He turned his back to the approaching Soviet tanks and walked straight into the yard of the prisoners. He was walking into the lion's den. It was May 1945. Barth, Germany. Stalag Luft I. This was one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps for Allied airmen in Nazi Germany. For years, it had been a place of misery, cold, and boredom. But now, it was a powder keg. The Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler was dead or hiding. The guards were terrified. Inside the camp, the American senior officer was Colonel Hubert Zemke. He was a legend, a fighter ace with nearly 18 victories. He was the kind of man who commanded respect just by standing still. Zemke watched from the window of his barracks. He saw the German Commandant, Colonel Gustav von Warnstedt, walking across the compound without an escort. The air smelled of burning paper and unwashed bodies. It was the smell of the end of the world. Zemke grabbed his jacket. He knew what was happening. The SS had sent orders. According to a diary found later in the barracks, the mood was electric. The entry read, "We could hear the rumble of the Russian guns. The guards looked more scared than we were. We knew something was about to break." Zemke stepped out into the mud. The wind was bitter for May. He walked to meet the German colonel in the middle of the compound. Thousands of eyes watched them. American pilots pressed their faces against the dirty glass of the windows. The German officer looked tired. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were hollow. He stopped 3 feet from Zemke. "Colonel," the German said. His voice was steady. "Commandant," Zemke replied. "The SS orders are to march the prisoners west. Immediately." Zemke stiffened. A forced march in this weather, with starving men, was a death sentence. It was a liquidation order in disguise. "My men can't walk," Zemke said. "You know that." "I know," Warnstedt said. He looked at the guard towers. "If we march, half of them will die. If we stay, the SS might execute us all for disobedience." This was the turning point. The German officer had a choice. He could follow orders, march the Americans into the freezing night, and save his own skin with his superiors. Or he could defy the SS. "I will not march them," Warnstedt said quietly. Zemke looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't a monster. This was a man trying to keep his soul in the middle of hell. "Then what is your plan?" Zemke asked. "I am giving the camp to you." The words hung in the cold air. Warnstedt unbuckled his holster. He didn't hand over the gun, but he rested his hand on his belt. "The guards are leaving tonight," the German continued. "I have ordered them to retreat west, toward the British lines. They want to surrender to you, but they are afraid of the Russians." "And you?" Zemka asked. I am staying until the last guard is gone, to ensure no one shoots. That night, the camp transformed. A letter home from a lieutenant described the scene. It was eerie. The spotlights were off. The dogs stopped barking. We watched the German guards packing their bags like tourists leaving a bad hotel. But the danger wasn't gone. It had just changed shape. As the German regular troops fled, the vacuum of power created a new threat. The countryside was full of wandering SS units, fanatical Hitler youth, and the approaching Soviet vanguard. The Soviets were known for their brutality toward anything German, and sometimes they weren't too careful about distinguishing liberated prisoners from enemies. Zemka realized something terrifying. Without weapons, his 9,000 men were sitting ducks. He needed guns. He went back to Warnstedt's office. The German colonel was packing personal files. A picture of his wife was on the desk. I need the armory, Zemka said. Warnstedt looked up. That is against regulations. The war is over, Gustav, Zemka said. It was the first time he used the German's first name. If the SS comes back to liquidate the camp, I can't defend these men with rocks. The German colonel paused. He walked to the window and looked out at the camp he had ruled for years. He saw American flags being stitched together from scraps of cloth. The keys are on the hook, Warnstedt said. Take them. It was an act of treason. It was an act of humanity. Within an hour, American POWs were armed with German Mauser rifles and machine guns. They manned the guard towers. They wore American uniforms, but they held Nazi weapons. They weren't prisoners anymore. They were a battalion. But then the real test came. The Russians arrived 2 days later. They didn't come with handshakes. They came with T-34 tanks, crushing the fences. The Soviet soldiers were drunk on victory and vodka. They were aggressive. They saw German uniforms and raised their rifles. They dragged German civilians out of houses nearby. They were looking for officers. They were looking for the commandant. Warnstedt had not fled. He had stayed to ensure the transition was peaceful. Now he was trapped. The Soviets wanted his head. A Soviet political officer, a commissar, marched up to the main gate. He demanded to see the German command staff. He had a list. He wanted to execute the fascist beast who ran the camp. Zemka stood at the gate. He was flanked by 2 American pilots holding German MP-40 submachine guns. "Where is the German colonel?" the commissar shouted in broken English. Zemka didn't blink. "There are no Germans here," Zemka lied. "Only us." "We saw him," the Russian insisted. "We know he is here. Give him to us." This was the moment. Zemka could have stepped aside. Warnstedt was the enemy. He represented the regime that had killed millions. Giving him up would have been easy. It would have been politically safe. But Zemka remembered the march that didn't happen. He remembered the keys to the armory. "I said—" Zemka stepped closer, his chest almost touching the Russian's chest. "This is an American camp. You are under my jurisdiction." The Russian hand drifted to his pistol. The American guards raised their machine guns. The click of the safety catches echoed in the silence. For 10 seconds, World War III almost started in a muddy field in Germany. "You protect a Nazi?" the Russian spat. "I protect my prisoner," Zemka said, "and he is under the protection of the United States Army Air Forces." The Russian stared at him. He saw the resolve in the Americans' eyes. He saw the machine guns in the towers, machine guns that Warnstedt had given them. The commissar swore, spat on the ground, and turned around. The tank engine roared, and the Soviets moved on to find easier prey. Inside the command bunker, Warnstedt let out a breath he had been holding for an hour. Later that night, the two men shared a bottle of schnapps. It was the last bottle in the officers' mess. "Why?" Warnstedt asked. "You could have let them take me." Zemka swirled the drink in his glass. "Because you didn't march us," he said. "That was just logic," the German replied. "No," Zemka said. "That was a choice." The next morning, the extraction began. Operation Revival. American B-17 bombers flew in low, not to drop bombs but to pick up men. The sky was filled with the roar of engines, but this time it was the sound of freedom. Zemka ensured that Warnstedt was not thrown into the general holding pen with the SS prisoners. He personally vouched for him. He ensured the German colonel was treated with the dignity of an officer. According to the official reports, Colonel Gustav von Warnstedt was taken into U.S. custody. He testified at war crimes trials, not as a defendant, but as a witness for the defense of other decent men. He eventually returned home. He lived a quiet life, but every year he received Christmas cards from America. Zemka and Warnstedt never fought again. They had fought their own private battle against the madness of their orders, and they had won. In the end, the history books talk about battles and treaties. They talk about generals and maps. But they rarely talk about the moment when two enemies stand in the mud, look each other in the eye, and decide to be human. War creates monsters. We know that. But sometimes, in the darkest places, it creates brothers. If you want more forgotten stories of the gray areas of WWII, subscribe. This channel exists to bring the truth back to life. A uniform defines which side you are on, but your actions define who you are. This was the camp where the enemy saved the prisoners, and the prisoners saved the enemy.